Pacific, it's the largest ocean in the world, and there are 14 national societies that I'm representing here at this conference. We form part of the larger group of the International Federation of the Red Cross, so we're a very diverse group. It's always it would be a mistake to think we can all be coated with the same brush. We all have different issues when it comes to climate change. We all have different geographical structures. I think the commonality is that we are islands, and as islands we are being affected, by issues of climate change at a global level. And our purpose at this conference is basically to discuss these things, to learn more, in fact, about what's going on globally, what are the global discussions, and to bring it down to a local level that's relevant to us.
Could you tell me about the specifics on the ground? Perhaps choose one island and tell us how climate change is perhaps already affecting that community or might do in the future.
Okay, probably the most widely discussed island in the Pacific are the islands of Kiribati in the northern Pacific, and they're very low-lying islands. So rising sea levels has affected land availability for its people, and displaced people is what we're talking about into the future. People that are moving from islands that are being taken over by water, moving to higher ground, and there's not much of that. So there is a real issue of migration of people because of rising sea levels, and that's probably a classic example out of the Pacific. But it's not just Kiribati. In Fiji, for example, we have villages. The government of Fiji has identified villages that are being affected by climate change because of rising water levels. And to my mind, I think we're talking about in the region of about 40 villages identified so far in Fiji that are likely to be moved or displaced into the future because of climate change or rising sea levels and other environmental changes that are happening, which will not allow these people to remain sustainably on their land in their current village settings as they are now.
In terms of Kiribati, we're already committed. We've already seen climate rise by 0.8 degrees Celsius. There's a good chance it will go to 1.5. As I understand it, would that make Kiribati habitable or not, or are people already preparing to evacuate?
I don't want to, create any alarm here, but, looking into the future, you're talking, 10, maybe 20 years, if not less. There will come a point when I think that the Kiribati government will seriously have to look for alternatives for their people. And it's primarily relocating people that we're talking about. I understand with the Fiji government has also, has taken that into account, and Fiji is probably one of the larger islands in the South Pacific. So if there are discussions happening on a government-to-government level with regards to, displaced people or people that have to move, I believe Fiji would be able to step up in that regard and assist a country like Kiribati. But it's not an easy thing to move people off their land, a land that they're tied to historically, culturally, in every other sense of the word. It is their sovereign nation, and as such, when you're losing land because of a change in the climate that is being perpetuated by people in other parts of the world, it's very hard to grasp for a lot of people, and I think that's a challenge for the Pacific and for the people of Kiribati, being able to understand what's happening and finding the solutions for them as a nation. Yeah, that'll probably be the biggest challenge ahead, but it's likely to happen. How soon? We can't really tell, but that's something that's very serious for the Pacific.
Who will pay?
That's a good question. And I suppose it's at conferences like this where we can all raise our hands and say, well, who should pay? Who should be responsible for climate change as it's affecting small island nations? And we can all put our hands up and say, well, it should be the big countries. ideally, that should put money into a fund and have it ready for this relocation exercise, this migration that's going to happen as a result of climate change and, the green gas and, there's all these terms that you throw in, but the reality is it's human lives being affected. Who should pay? It has to be the larger countries, in my view.
However, I understand that the larger countries, including the US, and people have said that a mechanism like loss and damage is a red line for them, because obviously it's very difficult to associate who caused what and when. So they're saying countries should perhaps set up insurance schemes and take responsibility for it themselves and do it themselves, because that's an easier political sell. Ultimately, people have to believe in this. Is that something you're working on in countries like Fiji?
No, I'm afraid not. Not something that we're working on. In fact, if there's anything that's happening at a national level, it's being pursued and put into place by the government of the day. I know there are opportunities for us to be able to secure funding through, donor agencies, and that's something that we probably work on as a country. But coming down to, the Red Cross that I'm here representing, we are always on the lookout for donor funding so that we can tap into it and effect certain programs that that enable us to do activities, to run programs that affect the vulnerable people who we are here to serve as Red Cross.
What are you doing already to help these people adapt and prepare?
Well, there are a couple of things that we are doing. In terms of the National Society of Fiji Red Cross, we have, our focus has been on health, climate change as a result of, diseases that have come about as a result of climate change, and that has been a key project for us at the moment. We're part of a pilot project that's being run in 7 countries around the world. Fiji is one. And it was basically research that was undertaken in about 10 pilot sites around Fiji, and identifying the diseases that have come about as a result of certain climatic changes to the villages that we identified. And, the diseases that have come about that are very prevalent are, dengue fever, diarrhea, leptospirosis, and, a fourth one which escapes me, I apologize. But understanding disease, and through our work at the Red Cross, is basically getting people more resilient, getting them to understand what are these diseases, how are they caused, and the basic preventative measures that can be taken, to enable them to be able to adapt, mitigate, what are the words that, most appropriate, but make them resilient into the future. Because ultimately the health of the vulnerable is where we're concerned. Our primary role is meeting the needs of the most vulnerable in our communities, and health is a critical part of that. Yeah.
So it seems to me that you're already taking action on the ground in terms of health. Does it necessarily help to talk about climate change? How does that help that situation? Because surely it's about the practical action on the ground now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Practical action is what the Red Cross is all about. And we can come, conferences such as this, address the global issues of climate change. Societies such as the Red Cross come into effect because we do the practical. We implement programs that are able to address basic things. We create advocacy and, public awareness of the issues that are of climate change, and you bring it down to the most basic level. So yes, Fiji is very proactively involved in that. The Red Cross specifically is involved in health, and I think that's really important that we continue to go out there and do the practical things that affect everyday life, for men, women, and children, and that's really critical.